man signed his name on a piece of paper and 2,000 people died within the hour. He did not scream. He did not sweat. He checked his watch. He noted the time in a logbook and moved on to the next transport. This was his job every single day for years. His name was Rudolf Höss, and he ran the single deadliest killing site in human history, the way another man might run a factory floor. If that thought makes you sick, stay with us because it gets worse and you need to hear all of it. Subscribe to Timelines of War right now before we go further, because this channel exists to tell the stories most people are too afraid to tell in full, and there is more waking nightmare history coming every week if you stay with us. Rudolf Höss was born on November 25, 1901 in the quiet spa town of Baden-Baden in southwest Germany. His father had served in the German colonial military in East Africa before running a small business, and at home, he ruled the household like a commanding officer. He was a strict Catholic who demanded total obedience and wanted his son to become a priest. There was no softness in that house and no room for questions. Rudolf later said he was never allowed to question adults and that fear and doubt were things to hide, never to express. That single lesson that emotion itself was a weakness to be buried would define the rest of his life, and it would resurface decades later inside the walls of Auschwitz. At 12 years old, he watched Germany erupt into World War I, and by 14 he had lied about his age to enlist. He fought on the brutal Ottoman front in territory that today includes parts of Iraq and Palestine. He watched friends and officers killed around him in the heat and disease of that campaign, and became one of the youngest non-commissioned officers in the German military by age 17. He was a teenager who had already seen more death than most soldiers see in a lifetime, and it hardened something in him permanently. Germany's defeat in 1918 and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles that followed left him feeling betrayed by his own government. Like thousands of angry veterans, he joined the Freikorps, violent paramilitary units who crushed communist uprisings in German cities between 1919 and 1921 with extreme nationalist fervor. In 1923, that violence turned personal. Rudolf took part in the murder of a schoolteacher named Walter Kadau, suspected of informing on a nationalist figure who had been executed by French forces. Rudolf and several others lured Kadau into a wooded area, beat him, and shot him. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served his time in Brandenburg prison, and instead of reflecting on what he had done, he spent his sentence reading nationalist and racist literature and connecting with other extremist inmates. He came out unrepentant. He came out radicalized, further convinced he had acted as a patriot rather than a killer. After roughly 6 years, he was released under a general amnesty for political prisoners and walked into a Germany still spiraling toward economic collapse and political extremism. When Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, German democracy collapsed within months. Political opponents were arrested. Trade unions were crushed. The Enabling Act handed Hitler dictatorial powers almost overnight. Rudolf joined the SS the following year, an organization led by Heinrich Himmler and built entirely around the idea of racial supremacy. Members had to prove Aryan ancestry and were trained to believe they belonged to a historic racial elite. He was exactly the kind of man Himmler wanted, someone who had already killed for an ideology and already proven he would obey without hesitation. In December 1934, he was sent to Dachau, the first concentration camp of the Nazi regime, opened near Munich the year before, where he trained under Theodor Eicke, the man who literally wrote the rule book for camp brutality. Guards were taught to feel nothing toward the people in their custody. Prisoners were stripped of names and reduced to numbers. They were subjected to starvation, flogging, standing cells, and public executions designed purely to terrorize everyone watching. Rudolf later called Dachau his true education. It was the place where he learned how to control large groups of prisoners through fear, and how paperwork and organization could sustain systematic cruelty at scale. By 1938, he had moved to Sachsenhausen, serving as adjutant and running records labor assignments and camp discipline with a cold efficiency that impressed his superiors and marked him as exactly who Himmler needed for what came next. World War II began on September 1, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland, and within months the SS needed camps built fast to absorb the flood of prisoners pouring in from occupied territory. In May 1940, at 38 years old, Rudolf Höss was appointed commandant of a new camp near a Polish town called Auschwitz, which the Germans renamed Auschwitz. On June 14, 1940, the first transport arrived carrying 728 Polish prisoners. Within weeks, more prisoners followed, and what started as a camp for Polish political prisoners expanded almost immediately. Prisoners were forced to build their own imprisonment, digging drainage systems and extending barbed wire fences on rations barely above 1,300 calories a day. Disease spread unchecked, especially typhus. Public hangings were staged as a warning to everyone else in the camp. Everything changed in June 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, and millions of Jewish people across Eastern Europe fell under Nazi control at once. What had only been discussed in private now became official policy. It was the final solution: Hitler's direct order for the systematic murder of the Jewish people of Europe. Himmler summoned Rudolf to Berlin that summer and told him personally that Auschwitz would be central to the plan and that he needed to prepare the camp for killing on a massive scale. Construction began immediately on a massive expansion called Auschwitz-II, or Birkenau, eventually stretching across more than 400 acres and holding over 300 barracks. At the same time, mobile killing units called Einsatzgruppen were following the German army into Soviet territory and shooting tens of thousands of people at a time in places like Babi Yar outside Kiev, where over 33,000 Jews were shot in just 2 days in September 1941. Similar massacres unfolded across Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine, but mass shooting had a fatal flaw for the men ordering it. It was slow. It required enormous manpower and constant transport of ammunition, and graves had to be dug by hand. Even Himmler reportedly became physically ill after witnessing one mass shooting in person near Minsk in August 1941. The soldiers pulling the triggers were breaking down psychologically from executing women and children at close range day after day, so Nazi leadership began searching for a method that would put distance between the killers and their victims. That search led to Zyklon B, a pesticide manufactured by the German company Degesch that released lethal hydrogen cyanide gas on contact with air. In early September 1941, several hundred Soviet prisoners of war were sealed in the basement of Block 11 at Auschwitz and used as the first test subjects. SS men poured the pellets into openings, and within minutes the gas spread through the sealed rooms. All of them died from suffocation as the cyanide blocked oxygen in their blood. Rudolf later admitted that once he saw how effective it was, he knew immediately it would replace shooting entirely. It required fewer guards, and the victims could be deceived until the very last moment. He talked about mass murder the way a manager talks about improving output, not the way a human being describes watching genocide unfold in front of him. After the Wannsee Conference on January 20, 1942, formalized the machinery of the Holocaust across the entire Nazi bureaucracy, construction moved fast. Between 1942 and 1943, 4 massive crematoria complexes rose at Birkenau, each one built with underground undressing rooms and gas chambers disguised as ordinary showers. New arrivals were told they were simply being disinfected before returning to camp life. They were ordered to undress calmly, stack their clothes neatly, and even remember where they left their shoes. It was a deliberate deception designed to prevent panic and keep the killing on schedule. Once the doors sealed, guards wearing gas masks dropped Zyklon B pellets through openings in the roof or side vents, and death came within 15 to 20 minutes, though it could take longer in an overcrowded chamber. Survivors and Sonderkommando prisoners who worked near those chambers later testified to what those final minutes sounded like as people pounded on the walls and climbed over one another trying to breathe. Afterward, Jewish prisoners forced into this labor removed the bodies, extracted gold teeth, cut hair, and loaded corpses into the ovens. So many were killed that when the crematoria could not keep pace, open pits were dug behind crematorium vide to burn corpses outdoors, especially during 1944 at peak capacity. Rudolf later stated up to 2,000 people could be gassed at once in the largest chambers. The entire operation ran on train schedules with deportations arriving from France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Greece, Italy, and other occupied countries, and selections were made the instant a train stopped on the arrival ramp. Those judged unfit for labor were murdered within the hour. Rudolf personally oversaw every part of it. He coordinated transport numbers with Adolf Eichmann's office in Berlin. He managed construction timelines with SS engineers like Karl Bischoff. He enforced brutal discipline among his guards and tracked the daily death count with the precision of a factory manager reviewing output numbers. Records show hundreds of thousands were murdered at Auschwitz in 1943 alone, but that number was dwarfed by what came next. By 1944, most Jewish communities across occupied Europe had already been destroyed, but Hungary was different. Its population of roughly 725,000 Jewish people was still largely intact when Germany occupied Hungary in Operation Margaret on March 19, 1944. Eichmann arrived in Budapest almost immediately with a small SS team and organized mass deportations, with help from Hungarian authorities. Ghettos were set up across the countryside that April and Jewish families were forced from their homes into collection points. Rudolf had actually left his post the year before, but Himmler ordered him back to Auschwitz that May because his experience running the extermination process was considered irreplaceable for an operation of this scale. Between mid-May and early July, roughly 437,000 Hungarian Jews were transported to Auschwitz and murdered. Some days saw 4 trains arrive at once, each packed with 2,000 to 3,000 people, crammed into cattle cars built for livestock. It became one of the fastest, largest mass killing and deportation operations of the entire Holocaust, and Auschwitz was now running at the highest killing rate it would ever reach. By January 1945, it was all collapsing. The Soviet Red Army advanced fast through Poland, and German front lines were falling apart. The SS forced roughly 56,000 prisoners onto death marches west, through freezing winter conditions, shooting anyone who fell behind from exhaustion or cold. Behind them, the SS burned documents and demolished crematoria 2 and 3 with explosives, desperate to erase evidence of the genocide before retreating. When Soviet soldiers from the 60th Army entered the camp on January 27, 1945, they found roughly 7,000 prisoners left behind, most too sick to walk, and warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with the shoes, eyeglasses, suitcases, and human hair of the dead. Rudolf was already gone. He had fled under direct orders from Himmler, hiding under the false name Franz Lang and working as a farm laborer near Flensburg in northern Germany. He grew a beard and tried to disappear into the chaos of a collapsing country. For months he evaded capture until British investigators tracked down his wife Hedwig and made clear what would happen to her and their children if she said nothing. Under that pressure, she gave up his location. British military police arrested him near Flensburg on March 11, 1946, and he was beaten during interrogation and initially denied his own identity before eventually confessing to being Rudolf Höss. He was brought to testify at the Nuremberg trials in April 1946 as a defense witness for Ernst Kaltenbrunner, and what stunned the courtroom was not what he said, but how calmly he said it, walking through the machinery of mass murder in the flat procedural tone of a man describing an ordinary workday. He was later extradited to Poland, where most of his crimes had taken place, and tried before the Supreme National Tribunal in Warsaw beginning March 11, 1947, on charges of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide, for the systematic murder of prisoners between May 1940 and January 1945. On April 2, 1947, the tribunal sentenced him to death by hanging. 2 weeks later, on April 16, he was brought back to Auschwitz itself. A wooden gallows was built near crematorium, not far from the office where he had once worked as Commandant, and at 45 years old, Rudolf Höss was executed on the grounds of the camp he had spent years perfecting into an instrument of genocide. There was no large crowd. It was done formally and quietly, and he was buried afterward in an unmarked grave, denied even the basic dignity he had stripped from every single person who ever passed through his gates. What makes this story so hard to sit with is not that he lost control at any point. It is that he never did. He stayed calm through all of it. He stayed organized through all of it, treating genocide and mass murder like a management problem, to be optimized rather than the destruction of millions of human lives. That terrifying calmness is exactly why his name still stands as one of the darkest in recorded history. If this disturbed you the way it disturbed us while researching it, make sure you are subscribed to Timelines of War, because we cover the darkest corners of history that most channels are too afraid to touch, and there is another story just as hard to watch already coming your way.